Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to another insightful discussion on the subject understanding the self. Today, we'll be delving on a very important topic or lesson, which is psychological self. Now, this lesson presents the psychological theories that influence the way people understand the self and the growth processes to live life to the fullest. Now, understanding of the self is highest when the different parts of the self becomes integrative. Okay, to start with, let's begin with the psychology of self. Now, the psychology of self is the study of the cognitive or affective representation of one's identity. In modern psychology, the earliest formulation of the self derived from the distinction between the self as I, the subjective knower, and the self as me, the object that is known. Now, we'll be discussing more about these in a while. Now, please take note that the self as cognitive construction was actually proposed by William James. He was one of the first to postulate a theory of the self in the principles of psychology. Now, William James described two aspects of the self, and he termed it the I self, or the subjective knower, and the me self, or the object that is known. Now, let's try to discover more about these concepts. Now, William James distinguished, as I've mentioned, two understanding of the self as me and the self as I. Now, the me corresponds to the self as an object of experience, or the self as known, while the I refers to the subject of experience, or the self as knower, that is pure ego and consciousness itself. Now, the I self, please take note, reflects what people see or perceive themselves doing in the physical world. Example, recognizing that one is walking, eating, writing, or anything that you're doing at the moment. Okay, so again, when we say I self, this reflects what people see or perceive themselves doing in the physical world. Okay, now the me self is a more subjective and psychological phenomenon referring to individuals' reflections about themselves. Now, example, characterizing oneself as, let's say, athletic, smart, and cooperative. Let's say this is how you view yourself mentally. This is how you look at yourself. This is how you imagine yourself to be. Okay? Now, there are three components of the me self. The first component is the material self. Now, according to James, this is the component of self that we tend to be most affected with as we invest ourselves with things like clothes, families, and home. Now, please understand that other terms such as self view, self image, self schema, and self concept are also used to describe the self. Referent thoughts, characteristics of the me self. This is actually according to James himself. Now, James further distinguished, as I've mentioned, three components of the self. Okay, I've mentioned that the material self is what we tend to be most affected with because we actually deal with a lot of tangible objects or possessions that we collect ourselves. Okay. Another component of self, according to James, is the social self. Now, the social self, example, how we interact and portray ourselves within different groups, situations, or persons, all are part of the social self. Now, it is based on our interactions with society and the reactions of others that are analyzed in order to contribute to our idea of social self. So when you say from the word social, we are relational, we are interactive, we interact with our close group, with our peers, with our family, with our co-workers. So all of these interactions now brings about the idea or the concept of ourself. The last component of the me self, according to William James, is the spiritual self. Now, example of which are internal dispositions, meaning our belief. Okay. Now, it is said to be that the most intimate self is the spiritual self. It is who we are at our core and something permanent like personality, core values, conscience, etc. Okay, so this is something that delves deep within us. And according to James, this is actually who we really are. All right. Now, another idea or another important concept under the psychological self is the real and ideal self. Now, Karen Horney believed that people experiences anxiety and be able to develop strategies to cope with this, thus creating idealized self and actual self. So we all know that as we continue to live, we will always and we will continue to experience stress, anxiety, and we need to cope with these phenomena. Now, our phenomena. Now, according to Karen, we, in order to cope with this phenomena, we therefore create the ideal self and the actual self. Now, let's differentiate the real from the ideal self. Now, the idealized self is an imaginary picture having unlimited power or qualities on which the actual self, who we really are, failed to fulfill. Now, what does this mean? The ideal self concept, okay, this is the person who we would like to be. Again, this is the person who we would like to be. It consists of our goals, of our ambitions in life, and it is dynamic, meaning it changes over time. Okay, example. Okay, the ideal self in childhood is not the ideal self in our teens or our late 20s. Me, every time you were asked when we were elementary what or who we would like to become, some of us would say we want to become scientists, we want to become doctors, we want to become lawyers. But eventually, as we grow up and as we face reality, then these ambitions and these goals change. Okay, so that's the ideal self. Underlying both the idealized and the actual self is what we call the real self, which is revealed only when a person starts to find ways to deal and resolve anxiety and conflicts. Now, the knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions people have about themselves as they actually are, that is the real self. Again, the knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions people have about themselves as they actually are, meaning according to reality. That is what you call the real self. It is how we think, how we feel, look, and act. The real self can be seen by others, but because we have no way of truly knowing how others view us, the real self is our self image. Now, the real self can be seen by others, but we have no way of truly knowing how others view us. The real self is our self image. Okay, this is mostly what people see us. Okay, and that's real self according to Karen Horney. Now, according to the humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers, the personality is composed of the real self and the ideal self. Remember, Carl Rogers believes that the human basic motive is to be self actualized. Okay, that's the highest attainment or that's the highest goal of man, according to Carl Rogers. Now, to achieve such, the real self, which is the actual behavior, our actual self, and the ideal self who would like to become must be in a stage of congruence. Okay? Congruence. Your real self is who you actually are, while your ideal self is the person you want to be. Now, it is an idealized version of yourself created of what you have learned from your life experiences and the demands of society and what you admire in your role models. So, this is actually what you want to be. And for example, your parents are medical doctors who are respected and admired in the community, and experience tells you that in order to be happy, you need to be smart and and must have a high paying job. So your ideal self might be someone who excels in science subjects, and so you want to be like them. However, however, okay, your real self is far from this idealized image. Okay, even if you excel in science, but there are times, let's say for example, that you're afraid of blood. Upon seeing blood, you are shaking or you feel nervous. So that's your real self. Okay, you might excel in science or you might be good in science, but your real self tells otherwise. So you're not attuned of becoming a doctor. Okay. Now, while Donald W. Winnicott explained the theory about the true self, the unshaped, and the false self. Okay, now let's look into this. In this scenario, Okay, the false self may at times appear to be a healthy false self that is becoming compliant without the feeling of true self being betrayed. Okay. However, at times the unhealthy false self promotes the feeling of being forced to comply with the demands of situation. Now let's further expand this. As expounded by Winnicott, no false self may develop to protect the inner and more valuable true self. Okay, again, I will repeat that. According to Winnicott, the false self, okay, which is actually a healthy false self, as called by Winnicott, may develop to protect the inner and more vulnerable true self. Okay, example. When a child is raised in a healthy environment with a supportive caretaker or parents, the true self may develop, or the opposite, okay, may happen, where the child may feel that his truest needs is unacceptable, becoming unconsciously compliant and adjust with his or her behavior. Okay, so uh, okay, let me just clarify this. Okay, there are tendencies, as I've mentioned by Winnicott, that the false self may develop to protect the inner and more vulnerable true self. Now, there are situations, for example, wherein we tend to develop a false identity or a false self that is somehow vulnerable, and this is trying to force to comply with the demands of the situation, and that is actually the difference between the false and the true self. Okay, now the last concepts that I would like to share with you is self as proactive and agentic. Okay, as viewed by the social cognitive theory, people are capable of controlling their own lives. Okay, so according to social cognitive theory, we own our lives and we are in control. Okay, people are proactive and reflective, meaning the agent self resides over everything that involves decision making, self control, taking charge of situations, and actively responding. So that's for pro active and reflective. But let's begin the discussion with the agentic self. Okay. The agentic self, please take note of this, is defined as the aspect of human personality that is determined by future assessments of one's goals, objectives, and actions. Now, what is the function of the agentic self? Its functions are adversely affected by the generating, planning, selecting, and implementing the capabilities of the individual. Okay, so on the contrary, the proactive self make things happen. Okay, so if the agentic self, okay, is more of the futuristic goal, your goals, your ambitions. Okay, it's more about the how you plan to achieve those things. The proactive self, on the other hand, okay, make things happen instead of waiting for them to happen to you. Okay, active, from the word proactive, active means doing something, and the prefix pro before. Okay, so meaning you do something even before it happens. So if you are proactive, you are ready before something happens. Okay, we should develop, okay, what we call a proactive attitude. It is a personality characteristic which has implications for motivation and action. It is a belief in the rich potential of changes that can be made to improve oneself and one's environment. Now, this includes various facets such as resourcefulness, responsibility, values, and vision. So, these are some of the attributes that you need in order for you to be a proactive person. Okay. Now, our capacity to distinguish those that we are capable of accomplishing and those that are not described describes the quality of self-efficacy. Again, self-efficacy is our capacity to distinguish those that we are capable of accomplishing and those that are not and those that we are not capable, okay, of doing or achieving. Now, self-efficacy, okay, refers to an individual's belief in his or her capacity to execute behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments. That's why, okay, our belief, okay, our on how we view ourselves is very important because and it's also very important to identify our strengths and weaknesses. Now, it is through self-efficacy, it is through this ability to exert control over one's own motivation, behavior, and social environment. Okay, and these will actually help us to live a proactive life. Okay, so that would be all for the psychological self. I hope you gained important information that would help you develop and improve yourself in the psychological aspect of your life. So I would see you again in our next discussion.